This next theme is really about social communication, I think, understanding autistic communication, questions about some myths, I would say, around potentially the idea that autistic people are antisocial or that there are particular ways of communicating that are considered rude. Um, so I would love to hear from our panelists a little bit about this. Jean-Julien, est-ce que vous voulez commencer?
Oui, merci. Moi, cette question me fait beaucoup rire. Je vous invite à venir dans nos événements sociaux chez Oticon pour vous rendre compte que on n'est vraiment pas du tout des personnes antisociales, bien au contraire. C'est juste que la façon dont on interagit est plus directe et on tourne moins autour du pot. On a définitivement des capacités à échanger sur des sujets qui nous allument. Le smooshing, le small talk, les petites conversations, ça, on est peut-être moins fort là-dessus, ce qui peut donner l'impression qu'effectivement, on est un peu à l'écart. Mais pour rebondir sur le camouflage et le masking, ça fait un peu l'écho de ça. C'est que des fois, moi, je sais pas quoi dire en fait. Des fois, je ne comprends pas les attentes qui sont exprimées dans ces échanges sociaux-là. Et c'est pas que j'aime pas les gens, c'est pas que ce qu'ils disent n'est pas intéressant, c'est juste que pour moi, dans mon câblage cérébral, il y a pas de il y a pas de choses qui allument, il y a pas de connexion d'une certaine façon qui peuvent m'activer moi. Donc c'est pas que je rejette ça, c'est juste qu'il n'y a pas de lien avec ce type de situation. Par contre, comme je le disais en préambule, j'ai des discussions passionnantes avec mes collègues sur des sujets complètement dingue, que ce soit de l'astrophysique, de la plongée sous-marine, des voyages, des séries télé. Donc c'est vraiment aussi souvent compliqué d'avoir une conversation continue. Parce que l'intérêt va se porter sur des éléments précis d'une conversation, mais pas sur un flux continu de conversation. Fait que des fois, effectivement, les gens me disent, mais est-ce que tu écoutes ce que je te dis? J'ai dit, oui, j'écoute. Mais c'est que juste ce que tu me dis, en fait, j'ai rien à dire là-dessus. Tu sais, donc, et là, les personnes peuvent se braquer en disant, ok, ben, ce que je dis, ça t'intéresse pas. Je dis non, c'est pas ça. C'est juste que pour moi, j'ai rien de pertinent à dire là-dessus. Ok, c'est cool. Donc, je pense pas qu'on est fondamentalement d'opposition à la socialisation. C'est juste que ça vient moins, en tout cas personnellement, ça vient moins me chercher. Puis c'est pas une volonté de me retirer. Quoique des fois, pour être honnête, dans certains environnements très bruyants, quand il y a plusieurs conversations, je vais vous donner un exemple. Avec mon épouse, ça nous arrive d'aller au restaurant de temps en temps et on aime beaucoup ça, mais elle, pas tant en fait, parce que je suis en capacité d'écouter la conversation qui se passe à l'autre bout de la salle, mais pas nécessairement ce que ma femme est en train de me dire. Puis, donc, ça me prend tout mon effort pour me concentrer. Puis, j'adore ma femme. C'est pas que ce qu'elle dit n'est pas intéressant. C'est juste que mon attention est dirigée vers mille et une autres discussions qui alimentent ma conversation avec mon épouse. Alors, c'est un peu fou, mais c'est pour vous donner une illustration des fois de comment on peut paraître antisocial, mais qu'on ne l'est pas du tout. C'est juste que notre focus, notre mode de fonctionnement au niveau sensoriel n'est peut-être pas adéquat pour une communication linéaire. Et donc, ça peut donner ce type de conclusion-là. Mais rassurez-vous, au contraire, on est avide de conversations. On aime beaucoup avoir ces conversations, mais des fois, on décroche. Puis on rembarque plus tard, mais c'est comme ça qu'on fonctionne.
Thank you, Jean-Julien. So many interesting insights. Tonie, Jean-Julien spoke quite a bit about the idea that autistic people are not antisocial, but rather that might look a little bit different for many autistic folks, and that the sensory environment of a lot of social environments maybe pulls attention and may prohibit from engaging in what someone might think of as a typical social interaction. Do you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I'll make 2 points. One is I think I couldn't agree with Jean-Julien more that I would say it's different, not deficient. And I think that's often how autistic communication is perceived. And often that, you may see an autistic person in a nightmare of a sensory environment looking like they don't want to be there or that they're not having a great time. But I can also say that probably everyone on this webinar right now has attended an event and not wanted to be there for sensory things, for you're tired that day, you have work to do, or whatever it may be. So I think we all experience different levels of desire for social connection. I think that is one thing there, and I don't think there's something specific about autistic people that make autistic people inherently not have a desire to socialize. That has not been my experience, but also no two autistic people are the same. And so that's important. So I think one piece is that. The other thing I guess I want to share is there is a fascinating study that I really encourage everyone to look up. That was actually done in, I believe, the early 2000s, late 90s, around the double empathy problem, which was essentially, there was an autistic scientist who ran a study and had a group of autistic folks and had a group of non-autistic folks, and essentially had them both play the game Broken Telephone. So if I'm in the autistic group, I'm given a piece of information said in my ear, and I say it to the person next to me. It goes around the circle, and at the end, the point of the game is to ideally have the most accurate to what the first message was. Both groups independently, the autistic group and the non-autistic group, did fabulous. They were great at the game. However, when they mixed the groups, things fell apart. And that's when communication truly broke down. And what that study showed us, and there's been many studies since that have sort of built on this, is that autistic folks communicate differently, but we're seeing that autistic folks communicate with one another very well. Because essentially we're sort of speaking the same language. It's information transfer, it's direct. It's more based on precision and accuracy of the information rather than maybe relaying an emotion or using body language or using other things to convey meaning. So autistic communication maybe is more focused on that, whereas the other group, who were all sort of had the same communication style or similar communication style, were also really effective. And so what that told us is that when we work together, when we mix our groups and we have a neurodiverse group where we have lots of different ways of thinking and approaching things, that's where we tend to struggle to connect with one another. And I truly think, and this is sort of what's come out of this study too, is that while autistic folks, through the medical model and the reality we live in, are sort of coached and taught on an ongoing basis to build skills to be able to communicate with folks who are not autistic, that isn't necessarily reciprocated by the rest of the population. So the reason it's called the double empathy problem is, myself as an autistic person, I'm working very, very hard to understand what the non-autistic person may be conveying to me. So I'm trying to pick up their social cues. I'm trying to understand meaning the way they do. However, that effort is not always reciprocated.
Sorry. Thank you, Tonie. Very, very insightful. I'm wondering, just to add to that, because we did have someone put in this question, and I applaud them for their bravery, because it's a difficult question to ask, and I think it's an important question to address, around the relationship between tone and what you're talking about. Because I think oftentimes autistic people are perceived as rude. I would say, especially in the workplace, we hear this a lot, where perhaps that's also a difference between communication styles.
Yeah, I think we make a lot of assumptions. So when we have, in that same example, we have a neurotypical or non-autistic person and an autistic person communicating, we know that I'm trying not to use that word. We know that non-autistic folks tend to rely on body language and tone to convey meaning. So how I'm saying something, the tone I am using is a part of the message that I am conveying. However, many autistic folks tend to communicate focused on the information they need to convey. So you're receiving direct communication that it has all the words rather than needing to listen to my tone. So my tone isn't necessarily meaning anything. I'm not attaching any meaning to my tone. However, the non-autistic person that's receiving my communication is attaching assumptions to my tone based on how they communicate. And that's sort of where we come into the double empathy problem of, I understand, and I've been told as an autistic person that tone is an important piece of communication in the non-autistic world. I have had to learn that. I have had to sort of manage that and understand that has an impact. However, that same awareness and that same intention that autistic people are often required in these sort of communications isn't matched the other way. So in this case, let's say I'm received as rude, but the other person, let's say my manager, who is perceiving me as rude, is not necessarily taking the effort to understand that I don't attach meaning to tone the same way they do. And so we have a disconnect because we're not acknowledging we think differently.
That's really helpful. And I think the takeaway is that making assumptions about people's intention is really difficult when we come from a diverse perspective.